Hi, ICYMI listeners. I hope you've been resting, scrolling, and enjoying this holiday season. Today, our team is taking a well-deserved break, so we're bringing you an episode from our friends over at What Next TBD. Back in 2017, Slate senior tech editor Tony Tran decided to learn more about his grandfather. He didn't have much to go on except that his grandfather was an American soldier who served in Vietnam and lost touch with Tony's grandmother when she left after the war. But Tony's curiosity turned hopeful when he looked up his grandfather on a website called findagrave.com. From there, his journey led him to Texas, ancestry enthusiasts, and possibly an answer to who his grandfather really was. I love Tony's story, so let's go to his episode for What Next TBD. Enjoy.
The journey to find my grandfather started back in 2017 or thereabouts, when I decided to find his identity for the first time.
Tony Tran, Slate's senior tech editor, didn't have much information to go by. His grandparents met in Vietnam during the war.
And growing up, I never knew who he was, and my mom never knew who he was because her mom, my grandma, and her had lost contact with him shortly after the war. And my grandma was very, very kind of hush-hush about who he was, like very cagey.
Tony's grandmother left Vietnam not long after the war and was always pretty quiet about the specifics of the man she fell in love with.
We knew some things. We knew he was an American soldier who served in Vietnam during the mid to late 60s and left in the early 70s. And I always wanted to find his identity, and it wasn't until I embarked on this genealogy project was I able to find him.
Part of the way Tony did that was by using the website findagrave.com. The site is a vast repository of information. Pictures of headstones, family photos, little memorials to the dead.
Throughout the process of looking for his identity and trying to find out who he was, I would find different Find a Grave memorials and pages. And it always came across my mind, what if I found him on one of these websites one day? And I really kind of pushed that thought away because in my mind, I really just wanted to find him alive. So when it did come to the point where I discovered his Find a Grave page and his obituary and found out, yes, indeed, he had died back in 2013. I'll be honest, I was heartbroken.
Tony couldn't meet him, couldn't introduce his mom to her own father. But he could do something else.
It wasn't until a few years later was I able to make a trip down to where he was buried in Houston, Texas, a small town outside of Houston called Leggett. I remember pulling up to this churchyard and finding his grave pretty much immediately and just being completely overwhelmed with emotions. And so it was a really cool experience because not only was I able to find his grave and take a picture of it, but I was also able to find the graves of other ancestors that I had discovered and relatives that I had found throughout the process of researching and searching for him.
Tony put the pictures on findagrave.com, something he now also does for strangers, helping create a digital tribute to their loved ones, a place where they can gather or remember online.
It felt good to finally be able to not only lay eyes on his grave, but take a picture of it and memorialize him online for as long as that will last.
Today on the show, inside the creative, caring, and controversial world of findagrave.com. I'm Lizzie O'Leary, and you're listening to What Next TBD, a show about technology, power, and how the future will be determined. Stick around. When Find a Grave began back in 1995, it was a hobbyist website. Founder Jim Tipton liked to visit celebrity graves and discovered that other people shared his interest and wanted to have a community online.
And now it's kind of like this big volunteer-based effort to digitize and memorialize just different graves. And, a lot of it is based on the genealogical and ancestry community. people who are interested in researching their family's history, their relatives, where they came from. But it's also being used by people like historians and journalists and people who are interested in uncovering some piece of history. For me, it's also, and for a lot of other people who refer to themselves as gravers, it's also like this hobby that we undertake as well, whereby we, either digitize obituaries or people who have passed on recently, or we go out and we take pictures of different grave sites throughout the world, just so there's a record of it, a memorial to the people who have passed on.
How big is it? Like, how many graves are there? If if you're just a random person, you think like, let me see who I can find here. Is there a good chance you can find what you're looking for?
So there are thousands of graves being uploaded onto Find a Grave each and every day. I don't have the hard numbers in front of me, but I think the memorials that they have are well into the millions by this point. It's easily the biggest and also the most comprehensive digital memorial service of its kind. And I say that with the caveat that Find a Grave is pretty Western-centric. So, I mean, you're probably going to find more people within the realms of like America and also like places like England or France or Germany in there, rather than say somebody who lived and died in a small farm outside of Saigon, Vietnam. But yeah, there is a pretty good chance that if you have a loved one who has passed on, who has been buried, they probably have an entry on findagrave.com.
And I understand it's now owned by Ancestry.com. Clearly, they see some value in this part of kind of tapping into this big online genealogical community.
Oh, yes. And that's a relationship that kind of just seems obvious on the surface, that they would have a hand in findagrave.com because most of the people who do use it, and a lot of gravers, are people who are just ancestry enthusiasts, people like me who had questions about their past and their family and wanted to dig into it a little bit more. I believe they bought findagrave.com back in 2013. And, that raises a lot of different questions as well in regards to, what does it mean to have a service like this be owned and essentially operated by this huge private company, this corporation that, to be fair, just cares about the bottom line. But for the most part, though, findagrave.com has been pretty good about being its own separate entity. Like, it's still very much volunteer based.
Talk to me about the graver community that you're a part of. How does it work?
The graver community is it's very interesting, like any internet subculture is. The gravers themselves are all primarily based in these different web forums, including Find a Grave's own web forums, but also in various like Facebook communities and also on different like genealogy web forums as well. But yeah, they're just people who like mostly like to spend a lot of their time online talking and swapping tips about how to find certain cemeteries or what are the best practices or how to treat graves and whatnot. I found that like has been a ton of overlap between the ancestry community and gravers themselves. And if you know anything about the ancestry community, you know that they can be also a little bit like weirdly prickly sometimes. Like, people come into it with a lot of very, very strong opinions on how to go about different research tactics and whatnot. But ultimately, they are also just incredibly helpful as well, because, like an effort like this at its core is just quite altruistic as much as it is like a way to pass the time and a hobby of ours. Gravers like me and other people who I've met and a lot of the people I've spoken to for the story, they're doing this because they truly do care about memorializing and remembering the people who have passed on, whether it be, for future historical purposes or whether it be because we just simply believe that people need to be remembered.
Tony describes himself as a mercenary grave finder, a photographic hired gun. He takes requests from strangers online to track down and document different graves. But the motivations for other grave finders vary.
Yeah, there are people who like to, say, just create memorials to different people who have passed on on Find a Grave. So some people will literally pick up a newspaper and just read through the obituaries and create a memorial for all those people who have passed on, just to make sure that there is a record of it on Find a Grave. There's also a lot of people I know who do this process called mowing the lawn, where that's a Find a Grave term within the community for folks who just go through a cemetery and take a picture of literally every single gravesite they can see. And I know some folks who have had like tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of like photos taken and memorials uploaded just using this method alone. Those people tend to care much more about the cemetery specifically rather than any specific grave. But yeah, it's different ways and different approaches for how you can be a graver. But ultimately, the goal is the same. Like, we're just trying to memorialize those who have passed on.
When we come back, what happens if you don't want your loved one's grave on the internet? You know, before I got ready to talk to you, I went on Find a Grave and I looked for my great-grandfather, assuming he would be on there because he was a federal judge. I thought, like, okay, yeah, he was, kind of a public person. People would have maybe taken pictures of his grave. What I was not expecting was not just his page, but like all these other relatives of mine, and then photos of my mother as a little girl were on here. How does Find a Grave reckon with putting all this information that is sensitive, private, and in a lot of ways very surprising for relatives just online?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that I know that Find a Grave, the team at Find a Grave, and people at Ancestry.com are continuing to grapple with, because it is jarring when you just had a loved one pass away and you go out and you find out that their information, and not just their information, but also their photos are available online. It can be jarring, and it can be quite traumatic, especially if you're still in the grieving process. Find a Grave and Ancestry.com, I know, has come up with a few different rules and standards in order to try and fix this, or at least make it better for those who are grieving. Like, people who have just passed, I know that there is a certain time limit before a memorial can be made for them. And I know that there is kind of this unspoken rule within the Find a Grave community that if, say, you stumble upon the page of a loved one for you, like I stumbled upon the webpage for my grandfather, you are able to go on and message the person who created that page, or who owns that memorial page, and you can explain your circumstance. You can say, like, hey, this is somebody who was close to me who passed away. Could I have this page? And more often than not, I've never heard of an instance when people didn't just hand the page over. They'll just give you control and rights of that page. So in that small way, the community also recognizes sometimes that these issues can be very sensitive, and they try to meet the person who is grieving where they are.
There's a sort of interesting tension here that I think comes up with a lot of online genealogy projects like Ancestry.com or 23andMe, which we recently did an episode on, where you have some members of a family who are all in on going through this process, putting things on the internet, and maybe others who don't want any of their information up there, but it's out there anyway because, a cousin or an aunt or whoever is really interested in this.
That's just sort of the thing that a lot of people, including myself, like even now, has to contend with when it comes to embarking on these genealogy projects. Like one of the main things that I've read and that I've heard from other people when it came to advice when I started out with my genealogy project to find my grandfather, it's that you might not like what you find. And it's something that you have to come to terms with. Like, when you take a DNA test or when you start digging into these weird, more mysterious parts of your family's history, you might end up finding something that is just groundbreaking, just earth-shattering for you and your family. People, there have been stories about people finding out that their father isn't their actual father, or they were actually adopted, or things like that. Or in my case, I found out that my grandfather was dead. Not only that, but I found out that my grandfather was actually married when he had my mother back in 1966 with my grandmother. Yeah, all these different questions that we have, we think we might know the answer, but sometimes it turns out the answer can be very uncomfortable. It can be very painful even. But that's the risk we're all willing to take sometimes, especially when it comes to answering some of the biggest questions that we've had all of our lives. And for me, that was who my grandfather was.
All of this data that we're talking about, the names, the birth dates, in some cases, photos, family trees, where does it all go?
Right now, it's just all on Find a Grave currently. It acts as a good kind of repository to collect all of this information in a good way and make it available to the public. But, I think the other thing that's important to note is that when it comes to things like death records and birth certificates and census data, all that information is already available. Like people can go out and find that already. The thing that Find a Grave does is just puts it all online in one central location. And so people can be uncomfortable with, and I think it's completely fair to have all this data about a person in one place, just on one web page that anyone can visit. But the fact of the matter is that information is already out there and people want to find it, and they have good reasons to find it, I think, like my own genealogy project.
After writing the story, how do you feel about this process? Has it changed your feelings at all about being a graver or about Find a Grave?
Writing the story really gave me a good opportunity to reflect on why I do Find a Grave and why I continue to do it, even though I have found the identity of my grandfather. And for me, it's a few things. And I think, like, number one, it is just kind of a lovely way to spend a Saturday morning or afternoon. People don't typically associate things like cemeteries and graveyards with a peaceful, relaxing, fun time on a Saturday.
True.
But I think I would beg to differ. I honestly would. Most cemeteries are completely lovely places. I know here in Chicago, we have a handful of really, really great cemeteries. Graceland Cemetery in Chicago also acts as an arboretum. These are lovely places. People come here to walk their dogs. They come here to go on walks and exercise even. People take their lunch breaks there. Cemeteries, to me, act as this also, ironically enough, a kind of living museum, one that is constantly growing and occasionally shrinking and is constantly a reflection of the community and city that it's in. The other thing is, I just do genuinely believe that there is such an importance in remembrance and memorializing people who have passed away, no matter how big or small their lives actually were. I think about people like my grandfather, whose grave was frankly quite unloved, sitting in the middle of Leggett, Texas, in an empty, in a churchyard somewhere. How sad that makes me to think about the fact that his grave was unloved and no one was there to remember him until I took a picture of it, until I posted it online, until I was the one who made the effort to remember. I think there's a power to that. And frankly, I think part of it too is I would hope that someone would do the same for me one day.
Tony Tran, thank you for writing this story and for coming on to talk about it.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Tony Tran is a senior editor at Slate. And that is it for our show today. What Next TBD is produced by Evan Campbell, Patrick Fort, and Cheyna Roth. Our show is edited by Paige Osborne. Alicia Montgomery is vice president of audio for Slate, and TBD is part of the larger What Next family. And if you like what you listened to today, the single best way to support our work is to join Slate Plus. You get all your podcasts, including this one, ad-free. Just head on over to slate.com/whatnextplus to sign up. All right, we'll be back next week with more episodes. I'm Lizzie O'Leary. Thanks for listening.